Take notes and prepare your questions for later. The next speaker is Angelo Martelli from the London School of Economics and Political Science. Angelo is a PhD candidate in political economy at the European Institute at the London School of Economics, where he also works as research assistant and graduate teaching assistant in the economics department. He received his BA in International Economics Management from Bocconi University and has done graduate work at the Pompeo Fabra University. And he has a Master's of Advanced Studies in Economics. His research in applied labor economics is focused on the evolution of employment structures in Europe over the last 3 decades and the role of labor market institutions and reforms on job and wage polarization. Martelli has published articles in major newspapers, including the Wall Street Journal, written influential blogs in his field, and has been interviewed and cited in media outlets such as The Guardian, Handelsblatt, Global Edition, The Times, Higher Education, La Repubblica, and RAI. So let us welcome Angelo Martelli.
So first of all, thank you very much, Chair, for the generous presentation. And also I would like to thank the Center for Italian Studies, Professor Mignone, for inviting me, but also Dana and Josephine for the support over the past few weeks. So you will be asking yourself, why are we talking about employment polarization when actually the subject of this workshop is actually populism? Well, what I'll try to convince throughout this quick presentation is that actually a lot of the populist trends are actually backed by secular trends in the labor market. Now, I think, and this is a bit the roadmap that I try to follow. My doctoral research, which I recently submitted actually, it has to do a lot with labor market institutions, labor market reforms, income inequality. Some of these themes have been touched upon throughout this morning. And in particular, I focus on this phenomenon which is called job polarization, which I will explain with a very nice graph, which is very easy to understand. And it all came, why did I choose this topic? What is the motivation and broader relevance? There was this quote from Lawrence Summers at the Davos summit in March 2015, in which he said, robots are hurting middle-class workers, and education won't solve the problem. So actually, many of you this morning, including the provost, were looking at education as one of the possible answers. My idea is actually, and Lawrence Summers is actually also the former chief economist at the World Bank, which is an institution which promotes education a lot. Well, education is just part of the answer, cannot be the only answer. And I will try to actually explain how intermediate bodies, and we had the presentation this morning from Giorgio Benvenuto, could actually play a bigger role than they are currently playing, and also other types of institutions can play a larger role. So the big motivation, right now, every day you read in the news about the future of work, the future of jobs. Automation is displacing jobs everywhere. Well, actually, in the 1930s, John Maynard Keynes was already talking about this. He wrote in this a very short essay, which is called "Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren." He wrote, "We're being afflicted with a new disease of which some readers may not yet heard the name, but of which they will hear a great deal in the years to come, namely technological unemployment. This means unemployment due to our discovery of means of economizing the use of labor are running the pace at which we can find new uses for labor." So exactly what's happening also right now. So what I will try to show you is basically not the last 4 or 5 years of gig economy, Uber, Airbnb, everything you read in the news right now, but I will look at the last 3 decades and look at heavy automation, so robots on assembly lines, and try to show you how we have to trace back these trends a bit more in order to really understand how employment structures have changed and how these is actually affecting also political outcomes. So you read in, as I was saying, in the news with the Economist having an issue cover every 5 months about this. And Jeremy Rifkin already in 1995 talking about the end of work. What is job polarization? So basically, if you just rank occupations according to income from the poorest to the richest, polarization is employment growth in the poorest occupations, employment growth in the most highly paid occupations, and this hollowing out of the middle in the labor market. Okay? So this is the disappearance of the middle class. This is the disappearance of middle-skilled, middle-income occupations, which is in contrast a bit to what you see in emerging economies, where you actually have middle class which is emerging. And there was some mention of this by Professor Troiano this morning. Now, in particular, in the middle, and this is on US data, what you see is routine occupations. Okay? What do we mean by routine occupations? These are occupations which have tasks which are extremely easy to automate. So you're an assembly line, it's a routine job, and you can just use a robot in order to replace this type of workers. So what happens is that workers are forced either in then non-routine cognitive occupations or non-routine manual occupations. This is a bit inverted, so here you actually have the highly paid occupations, and here you have the lowest paid occupations. Now, in here, you basically have finance jobs, for instance, and here you basically have, for instance, an hotel attendant who has to fold a towel, which is still very difficult to be done by a robot. Okay? Now, the type of friends I meet in London, for instance, the Italian friends, pretty much resemble this. So you either meet a guy working at Caffè Nero, okay, or you meet a guy working in finance. And it's very difficult to find anyone who is working in a typical middle-class job. So London is an example of a city which is very polarized. Now, why is this important? And why is it different from, why I think it's slightly different from what Alessandro was saying, how the last 3 decades or more are a bit different. This is the last 3 recessions, so the last recession since the 1970s. In red, you've got all the recession periods. In blue, you have employment in routine occupations. What you can see is that after every recession, employment was going up, okay, in these routine occupations. Differently from the last 3. So what does this mean? Is that employers have actually used the opportunity of the crisis in order to replace jobs that are in routine occupations. Okay? They got rid of those jobs. With major implications, this is data for the US, you see death rates have been climbing for middle-aged white Americans, with experts attribute this to also drug abuse, alcoholism, and suicide. And this is pretty much, a trend for the US, okay, in contrast to other European countries. But I will stay out of any disputes regarding the US than on the political side, and because my research is mainly on Europe. So, but the puzzle is this type of polarization actually present in all European countries? So what I claim is that it is not, because of the different institutional framework that you see in each country. By institutions, here, the labor market institutions, I actually mean trade unions, I mean minimum wages, also unemployment benefits. Those are in employment protection legislation. Those are all institutions which contribute to shape the final patterns you see in the job polarization story. Now, I don't want to bore you to death with my conceptual framework for my papers, but just to understand why is it crucial, I think that labor market institutions, in a way, can play a huge role to mitigate the effects that you have from automation, from routinization, okay? Why is it so? Because institutions can actually, for instance, minimum wages, can create a minimum floor below which employers cannot actually create occupations. Therefore, this limits the creation of jobs, which can be also a negative thing, but it can also be a positive thing on the other. The same thing with employment protection legislation. Employment protection legislation really cares about, especially also, besides low-income workers, also about middle-income workers. And therefore, this limits the possibility of the hollowing out that we were looking at before. So what I try to understand in my research is then how does also polarization affect, for instance, the labor market reforms that we see, okay? And finally also, what are the effects for wage inequality? Now, this was my first paper, in which I basically tried to understand how does structural employment changes correlate to the disappearance of the middle class. And you got a lot of literature review there, which I will try to skip, but what are the effects on occupations and how does this lead them to political polarization? Well, I mean, Krugman is always arguing for how the institutions actually lead among low-educated workers to this trade-off between wages and employment. So high wage floors and powerful trade unions lead to low growth in low-skilled services and high employment, low inequality, whereas deregulation leads to job creation in low-end services but higher inequality. On the other hand, what you see on the demand side is basically that employers always can adopt for two roads. Either the high road or the low road, which is basically depending on the institutional permissiveness, low wage, low skill, low training, low productivity jobs versus high skill, high productivity. So you got an upgrade. Now, I use a lot of fancy econometrics, and at the end, what I actually show is that the most effective one is employment protection legislation that can still play a huge role compared actually to trade unions in the current form and minimum wages also in the current form. Okay? Now, this is a nice representation of what's going on. So in the second paper instead, I try to see the basic model I try to look at is, okay, so I've been talking about a manufacturing share as part of total employment, which is declining, right? Now, how does this translate into political outcomes? Well, because if the manufacturing base is also the power base of trade unions, right? Then we got an erosion of power of trade unions, right? What does this mean is that then this is also reflected at the parliament level, in which you basically have less obstacles to flexibilization in labor market reforms, because trade unions are not as strong as before as intermediate bodies, right? And this obstacle that basically now is gone, what happens is that it translates into big changes into also the way social reforms are being created, okay? So, and what you actually see, and this is just some preliminary evidence, I won't get into details, is that European governments have in several instances actually participated effectively in addressing the changes emerging as society moves from being a production and material-based society to an information services-based society. So you have countries, as I was saying before, like the UK, which are extremely polarized. The same thing for the Netherlands, in part also the Nordic countries. Whereas other countries, such as the Mediterranean countries, also some of the continental countries, which basically don't see this polarization because of the institutions, labor market institutions that are in those countries. Now, you're probably still asking yourselves, how does this then affect politics? Well, it affects politics because what you actually see is a politics of the extremes. Okay? Now, Nick Clegg was the head of the Liberal Democrats in the UK and deputy prime minister until he was defeated pretty badly in 2015. Just wrote this book, which has become a Sunday Times bestseller, which is called Politics Between the Extremes. And I think his main problem that he's trying to, for which he's trying to provide evidence for, is that we have actually come to a politics that is extremely polarized, right? Besides the identity politics part that we were talking about before, is that we are actually seeing parties, either you got the populists from the extreme right or you got the populists from the extreme left, okay? And both are, in a way, have been determined, according to my marginal contribution, also to labor market trends that you have seen in the past 3 decades. Now, I think I want to skip through these, but what this has also meant is basically an effect on income inequality. What does this mean? Is simply, if you have this U-shape that I was talking about before in occupations, this should reflect also in the wage patterns that you see, right? Because if there is demand for low-skilled jobs, then their wages should rise. And the same thing, of course, for high-income, high-paying occupations. Now, this is the US case, okay? And you actually see this wage polarization going hand in hand with a job polarization. So both income inequality and also technological change are affecting the way the population is evolving, in a way. This is not the case for Europe, where you actually see just a lot of wage inequality, but a bit more stability here. Okay? And this is still because of institutions. Now, I don't know how much time more I have.
5 minutes.
Okay. And in the UK Department for Business actually published this report, which was saying if only demand-side factors such as task-based bias, technological change are behind changes in labor market, we would expect wages and employment to move together. This is still for the EU, in particular for the UK. So producing similar changes in the job distribution and wage distribution. The fact that we do not observe this with growth in jobs but not in wages at the lower end of the labor market suggests actually that supply side factors could also be important there, with increased supply potentially coming from displaced intermediate workers, former benefit recipients pushed into work by eligibility changes or immigration. Now, as you can see, labor market trends are really underlying all the trends that you have talked about until now. Immigration, also welfare recipients. These are all, in a way, they've all been determined by what's going on in the labor market in the past three decades. Now, I think, in a way, for the past 30 years, especially I'm talking about the EU, in the EU, you got center-right and center-left parties with a broadly shared vision of Europe, which has governed how most European countries have actually behaved. Despite their policy disagreement, in a way they jointly embodied the ideological consensus that there was underlying European integration. And in a way formed a political coalition that built the single market, the euro, and also enlarged the EU. However, many voters in the past years have actually felt that these mainstream policies have failed, and governments have proved unable to protect unskilled and semi-skilled employees from the consequences of globalization and technological change. Now, and this is despite we actually have had massive education, mass education, progressive taxation, and social welfare benefits. This has not prevented the increasing inequality. That's why I'm saying education can be one of the answers, but it cannot be the only answers. At the government level, there needs to be also another type of action. Now, also there was one question this morning for one of the students, like how can we actually provide an answer to populism? How can we tackle populism? And I like this quote from Nick Clegg, because it brings us back to, Trump voters are irrational, Nigel Farage voters are irrational, and there is one thing he says, this is why I call the rise of this kind of politics, populist politics, from both left and right, an age of unreason. Not because the individuals who support these parties are necessarily irrational, but because reason is underpinned by doubt and open inquiry, both of which are shunned by populist politics. The politics of reason rests on a belief in the value of scrutiny and debate. It therefore requires an open state of mind, not a closed mantra of certainties. More than this, it requires a continuous acceptance of the possibility that one's opinion could be wrong. It is the means by which an imperfect world is navigated, even improved, but never made perfect. It is restless because it knows that the search for progress never really ends. It leaves the dreams of perfection to the religion. None of these things are acceptable to the politics of unreason. And I think, so therefore, more than irrationality, it's actually unreason. And we should actually, therefore, workshops like these, I think, are a great example of why, we should be debating about these things, and tensions are normal in a way to rise, because if we put some doubts into and we try to question, what is populism? In a way, we are really trying to find answers to this phenomenon. So with this, I would like to thank, again, the Center for Italian Studies and everyone. Thank you.